also just want to acknowledge whoever made the poster for today's talk, because it was awesome and made me look way cooler than I actually am. So I really appreciate that. So it's great to be here. So as Ben hinted at, in today's talk, I'm going to argue that the criminal justice system is a critical but largely understudied driver of population health inequality broadly, but racial health disparities in particular. In recent years, scholars have begun to highlight the increasing role of the criminal justice system in shaping the life chances of young blacks in the United States in particular, and contributing to societal level racial inequality. I argue in this study that given its role in economic and racial inequality more broadly, the criminal justice system also plays a critical role in producing black-white health differences. While I'm going to focus predominantly on the experience of incarceration in this talk today, I will also demonstrate how contexts along the criminal justice continuum, ranging from police stops to arrests, convictions, and ultimately incarceration, impact pre-disease markers of health and contribute to population health disparities. So since the 1960s, the number of incarcerated individuals in the United States has increased eightfold. And there's currently more than 2.2 million people in prisons and jails throughout the United States. The rapid expansion of the penal system in the US has led some scholars to argue that incarceration should now be considered a stage in the life course for some subpopulations. And in particular, black men and women have bared much of this burden of the recent increase in mass incarceration, with estimates suggesting that 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison or jail at some point in his lifetime, compared to a lifetime risk of about 1 in 17 for white men. And those smaller magnitudes, stark racial differences in incarceration also exist for women. On any given day in the United States, 1 in 10 black men in his 30s can be found in a prison or jail. Given that you all's theme this year for your colloquium is on capitalism, I wanted to talk for a minute about the fact that prisons and jails in the United States are big business. Scholars often use the term prison industrial complex to describe how and why the rapid expansion of mass incarceration in the United States has been linked to the political influence of private prison companies and businesses that provide goods and services to prisons and jails throughout the US. The most common agents of the prison industrial complex include the agencies, corporations, and industries that contract cheap prison labor, that build prisons and jails, that provide surveillance technology vendors, that provide food and healthcare services to prisons, prison guard unions, private probation companies, and the lawyers and lobbyists who all represent these industries. Many have argued that the best way to keep money flowing into these industries is to keep prison beds full. And the portrayal of mass incarceration as a means of creating employment opportunities and the utilization of incarcerated individuals' labor are particularly harmful elements of the prison industrial complex, as they boast clear economic benefit based on the exploitation of free or forced labor. Prison issues have recently garnered a lot of attention in the state of California, where incarcerated individuals have been voluntarily recruited to fight the state's record wildfires for the meager pay of approximately $1 an hour, plus $2 on the day. But the practice of using prison labor for cheap is fairly widespread in the United States, due in large part to an exemption in the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, but allows for the involuntary servitude as part of a punishment for crime. At least half of the nation's incarcerated individuals participate in some form of prison labor, often for pennies on the dollar or for nothing at all. The average pay of state prison labor in the United States is approximately 20 cents an hour. Many incarcerated individuals provide work required to keep prisons and jails going themselves: janitorial services, food service, healthcare, administration. Others work in quote-unquote correction industries, programs performing work in areas such as clothing and textile, computer-aided design, and making license plates. Some subcontract with private corporations, and in recent years, companies such as Sprint, Starbucks, and Victoria's Secret have been sort of at the forefront of these issues. And so I just wanted to share with you all a poster promoting the 2018 nationwide prison strike, which was organized by the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee in an effort to end what they call prison slavery. Still, we know that incarceration as an outcome most often stems from earlier stages of criminal justice contact. And of course, the process of incarceration is not the only place in the criminal justice continuum where stark racial disparities can be observed. Recent cases of Black men and women being targeted and killed by police has only highlighted racial disparities in police stops and arrests in particular. Both Michael Brown, who was stopped for jaywalking, and Eric Gardner, who was stopped for selling loose cigarettes, were killed at the hands of police. It was revealed that Philando Castile, who was shot by a police officer in Minnesota several years ago, had been stopped by police more than 40 times in a little over a decade, most often for minor traffic violations. So not that racial disparities in criminal justice contacts are by any means new, but these recent cases have served to raise serious concern both about the use of state violence against Black bodies, but also about the targeting of Black individuals and communities by the criminal justice system. And in many ways, Black-white differences in incarceration stem from disparities in earlier stages of criminal justice contact. Blacks are more likely to be stopped by police than whites. When they're stopped, they're more likely to be arrested. When they're arrested, they're more likely to be convicted. And when they're convicted, they're more likely to face harsh sentences. Policing practices such as broken windows and stop and frisk have produced stark racial disparities in police encounters, particularly given that these practices often intersect with officers' use of racially biased discretion. A couple of years ago, as Ben mentioned, I was living in the Durham, North Carolina area for graduate school, and I did some analysis of Durham Police Department data on behalf of some community organizations who were working there and concerned about racial profiling in the city of Durham. And our analysis revealed that while approximately 40% of Durham's population comprised of Blacks, Blacks accounted for more than 82% of all police searches. Even after we accounted for factors like potential confounders such as reason for the stop, time of day of the stop, age and gender of the driver, we still found that Durham police stopped and searched Black motorists at a rate of more than 1.65 times greater than white motorists. And of course, these racial disparities are not limited to Durham, North Carolina. Data from New York City's notorious stop and frisk program revealed that of the more than 685,000 police stops and searches in 2011, more than 90% of those stopped by police were Black or Hispanic. It's also worth noting that about 88% of these individuals were found not guilty of committing any crime. Further, Blacks are significantly more likely than whites to report police officer improper use of force and abuse of authority, suggesting that Blacks' experiences in police encounters are categorically more hostile than whites. While Black youth comprise approximately 17% of the juvenile population in the United States, they account for approximately a third of all juvenile arrests. And Blacks are more likely than whites in the United States to be arrested for drug-related crimes, a disparity that cannot be explained by racial differences in drug offending, non-drug offending, or residing in a neighborhood with a heavy police presence. Blacks also have a felony conviction rate that's approximately 3 times greater than the overall rate for adults in the United States, with approximately 1 in 3 Black men carrying a serious criminal record. And after controlling for a host of confounders, such as offense and arrest history, Blacks receive sentences that are approximately 10% longer than whites. Given these stark disparities in criminal justice contact, a small but growing body of literature has examined the effects of these contacts with the criminal justice system on health. And much of this work focuses on the experience of incarceration. A small number of studies have examined the health effects of pre-incarceration contacts with the criminal justice system. For example, using data from New York City, Geller and colleagues found that survey respondents who reported more police contact also had higher rates of anxiety and trauma. Again, using data from New York City, Sewell and colleagues found that living in a neighborhood categorized by aggressive policing and surveillance practices was associated with men's mental health risk in particular. Of the studies focusing on the health effects of incarceration, Some focus on the health of currently incarcerated individuals, and others focus on the health of individuals after they've been released. Somewhat surprisingly, studies of currently incarcerated individuals actually find some evidence of a short-term protective effect of incarceration, where there are documented short-term health benefits associated with incarceration, or more specifically, with the improved health care access that often comes along with being incarcerated. Rather than thinking of these studies as providing evidence of the protective, health-promoting benefits of incarceration, though, what these studies instead offer is a rather stunning condemnation of the circumstances and lack of health care access that individuals faced outside of prison and jail walls. Studies of formerly incarcerated individuals, on the other hand, have linked incarceration to a host of outcomes, including higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, depression, anxiety, sexually transmitted infections, and higher rates of overall mortality. And I argue in this paper that the stress process model, which was developed by sociologist Leonard Perlman, offers particularly important insights in how contacts with the criminal justice system broadly, and incarceration specifically, may be related to health. So if we apply Perlman's stress process model to thinking about criminal justice contacts, we can think about the exposure as the actual contact. That is the primary stress associated with the police stop, with the arrest, with the conviction, or with incarceration. Focusing explicitly on incarceration, we know from the literature that incarceration is a tremendously stressful experience for individuals. The loss of autonomy, the physical and emotional isolation, the fear of victimization, all contribute to these spaces as being extremely stressful environments. However, we know that the stress of incarceration extends beyond the time of release. Secondary stressors related to incarceration include things like difficulties securing housing and employment and battling stigma. So in this way, we can think about incarceration serving as both an acute stressor in the lives of individuals, as well as a chronic stressor that continues to affect them even years after release. The second stage of the stress process model involves threat perception and appraisal. And research suggests that stressors that are particularly harmful for health when they're considered unfair or out of one's control, which may be the case with incarceration and criminal justice contacts more generally. The third stage of the stress process model includes individual responses to stress. Emotional responses to incarceration-related stress could include things like anger, frustration, a loss of self-efficacy. Physiological responses, which are going to be much of the focus of my talk today, include the mental and physical arousal that occur from stress exposure. So in response to perceived or real threats, the body activates a number of physiological systems to respond to that threat or exposure. In more lay language, this is often referred to as the body's fight or flight response. In the presence of a perceived threat, the brain signals release of hormones to upregulate immune, metabolic, neuroendocrine, and cardiovascular changes. And while these changes are necessary for promoting and protecting health in the short term, long-term activation of these systems in response to repeated or more chronic stressors has been linked to higher levels of physiological malfunctioning and higher risk of mortality. Research also suggests that individuals may develop maladaptive coping behaviors such as smoking and drinking in response to stressors like incarceration. And so together, all of these emotional, physiological, and behavioral responses to the primary and secondary stressors related to criminal justice contacts may contribute to health and disease risk. Still, while a growing body of literature has examined the health effects of criminal justice contacts, there's sort of really a pretty relatively small number of studies that examine the relationship between mass incarceration, criminal justice expansion, and population health inequality, which leaves critical gaps in the literature. Of the studies that focus on the health effects of incarceration, most focus on infectious disease by studying the spread of infections within jails and prisons. And so consequently, there's really been this push to think about non-infectious disease outcomes in relationship to mass incarceration and criminal justice contexts. In particular, there's little known about the potential psychological and biological mechanisms underlying the linkages between criminal justice contacts and health. The literature suggests that stress may be a critical mechanism through which incarceration and other contacts harm health, But there's little research utilizing psychological or physiological markers of stress response, which leaves lots of questions about biological plausibility remaining in this literature. As a result, more research on whether and how the criminal justice system serves as a stress-inducing exposure that upregulates psychophysiological functioning across systems is ultimately needed. Few studies also assess whether the life course timing or duration of the incarceration experience in particular may also relate to health. Whether an individual is incarcerated as a teenager, in young adulthood, or later on in life likely has varying consequences for health. We could imagine that earlier experiences with incarceration may have stronger health impacts, given that these experiences may be particularly disruptive to life course socioeconomic trajectories, among other things, and may occur during particularly sensitive life course periods when individual health is particularly vulnerable to stressful shocks. However, this question really hasn't been addressed in the literature. Further, while a handful of studies have examined how sentence length may also be related to health, more research again here is needed. Finally, and something that I'm going to talk more about throughout the talk, is that a major concern plaguing the literature on incarceration and health is causal inference. All studies that use observational data are subject to concerns about causality and selection. But this is particularly true when we're thinking about the health effects of something like incarceration. The key exposure of interest in the study, namely incarceration, is not randomly assigned in the population for obvious reasons. And because of this, there are concerns that those who have been exposed to incarceration are somehow different in both measured and unmeasured ways from those who have not been exposed. For example, it's been argued that individuals who have been incarcerated may have a greater propensity for delinquency or risk-taking. They may come from households and neighborhoods that are categorically different and potentially more disadvantaged than those who have no contact with the criminal justice system. And so in this way, the concern is that any difference in health that we observe between individuals who have been incarcerated and those who have not may in fact rely on underlying differences between these populations, rather than reflecting any consequences of incarceration in particular. So this study attempts to advance scientific understanding of the role of the criminal justice system in population health inequality by examining three overarching research questions. The first, how is our contact with the criminal justice system, ranging from police stops through the process of incarceration, associated with markers of physiological and psychological health risk? Second, does the timing and duration of incarceration in particular matter for these markers of health? And finally, to what extent do black-white differences in criminal justice contacts contribute to racial disparities in health on a population level? To answer these questions, I used data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, which is a nationally representative longitudinal study of adolescents that began as a school-based survey of young people. Since its inception, AdHealth has since followed up with 5 waves. The 5th wave was most recently released within the past month or two, so this study just uses the first 4 waves of data. I used data from the in-home interviews, linked census tract data at waves 1, 3, and 4. I also utilized data from a biomarker collection study that occurred at wave 4. It's worth noting then that this study focuses on the health effects of criminal justice contacts early in the life course. As wave 1 was collected when individuals were just 12 to 20 years old, and the final wave that I utilized in the study occurred when individuals were in early adulthood, ages 24 to 32. Analysis is limited to blacks and whites with complete data on the variables used in the analysis. I limit my sample to blacks and whites primarily because of concerns related to sample size. That is, I didn't have sufficient respondents in the other racial ethnic groups to say anything meaningful about their differences in their contact with the criminal justice system. So for that reason, I limited the sample to these 2 groups. So this study includes 2 outcomes. The first is C-reactive protein, or CRP, and another is a measure of depressive symptoms. So CRP is an acute phase protein produced by the liver that is often used as an indicator of physiological inflammation. Evidence suggests that in response to stress, the brain releases hormones to upregulate the inflammatory arm of the immune system. And in response to chronic stress, individuals may experience low-grade chronic inflammation. Elevated levels of CRP have been linked from increased morbidity and mortality from a host of causes, but largely from cardiovascular-related diseases. The measure of depressive symptoms is a count variable based on the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. A number of studies have documented a link between stress exposure and depressive risk, and worldwide, depression is the leading cause of disability and has been linked to increased morbidity and mortality risk from a host of causes. I think that these two outcomes are complementary and that they reflect different aspects of stress response that are both unique and related. While CRP indicates the effects of stress on the body's immune and inflammatory responses, depressive symptoms in many ways indicate the psychological consequences of stress exposure. The key exposure of interest in this study is incarceration history, indicated by a dummy variable where 1 indicates ever having been incarcerated. I also utilize categorical measures indicating age at first incarceration and duration of first incarceration. Age at first incarceration is indicated by a variable indicating whether or not the first experience with incarceration occurred before or after the age of 18. And I consulted the literature to construct a measure of duration of incarceration, where studies suggest that stays of longer than 1 year have particularly salient consequences for health. While this study focuses primarily on incarceration, I will also show some analysis using pre-incarceration contacts with the criminal justice system. And to do this, I construct several dummy measures indicating ever having been stopped by police, ever having been arrested, convicted, or finally incarcerated. The racial disparity in the outcomes is indicated by a dummy variable indicating race, where 1 is black, and again, my sample is restricted to blacks and whites. I include a host of other covariates, which are largely measured at wave 1 at baseline. And I can talk in more detail about the measurement of these variables during the Q&A if people are particularly interested. But I just want to point out here that this list includes a host of potential confounders, including a measure of family socioeconomic status in adolescents, neighborhood characteristics, including neighborhood socioeconomic status, as well as racial composition, mental health status during adolescence, as well as measures indicating delinquency, whether the individual was a repeat arrestee, or whether the individual had been arrested for a violent crime. In terms of the analytic strategy, I'm first going to start with some descriptive analysis, paying particular attention to racial differences in criminal justice contexts, as well as the outcomes. And then I'm going to show the results of a series of analyses on the association between incarceration and health. My examination of the health effects of incarceration uses several analytic techniques, which together I argue provide a rather robust assessment of the potentially causal associations between incarceration and the markers of mental and physical health. In the first set of models, I examine the associations between incarceration and the outcomes using generalized linear models. This is the typical regression strategy utilized in the literature, where the outcomes are regressed on the exposure measures, controlling for the covariance. In the second stage of the analysis, I again use generalized linear models, but this time I limit my sample to what has been called strategic treatment control groups. So as I discussed earlier, isolating the health effects of incarceration can be difficult because of issues related to endogeneity and selection. For this reason, and I'll talk more about this, I use individuals who have been arrested and convicted, but not incarcerated, as a comparison group, by limiting my sample to only those who have been convicted of a crime, only some of whom go on to be subsequently incarcerated. And in stage 3 of the analysis, and again I'll talk more about this, I use inverse probability of treatment weighting with regression adjustment, again using this restricted treatment control sample. Finally, to examine whether or not pre-incarceration contacts with the criminal justice system might also be implicated in population health inequality, I will present results of models that regress the outcomes on the dummy variables indicating contacts with the criminal justice system using traditional generalized linear modeling techniques. I will also show results of mediation analyses, which help me to determine the extent to which black-white differences in criminal justice contacts contribute to population health inequality. So first, just moving on to some descriptive analyses. So with regard to the outcomes, the results provided here suggest that blacks have higher levels of both inflammation, as indicated by the higher levels of CRP, as well as greater risk of depression, as indicated by the count variable for depressive symptoms. This chart displays racial disparities in criminal justice contacts. So compared to blacks, whites were more likely to report no contacts with the criminal justice system, but they were also more likely to have reported being stopped by police. Blacks, on the other hand, were overrepresented among the arrested and those who reported being incarcerated. Importantly, supplementary analysis with this data showed that following a police stop, blacks were significantly more likely than whites to report a subsequent arrest. Now I'm going to walk through the results of the three-stage analysis on the association between incarceration and health. And so as a reminder, in this first stage, I run multivariate regression models, regressing the two outcomes on the incarceration exposures, controlling for that full set of covariates that I presented earlier. For each outcome, model 1 just includes the exposure of incarceration and all of the covariates, whereas models 2 and 3 account for the duration of incarceration as well as the life course timing of the incarceration experience, respectively. For both outcomes, model 1 suggests that formerly incarcerated individuals have higher levels of CRP and depressive symptoms than individuals who were never incarcerated, even after adjusting for a host of potential confounders. Regarding the duration of incarceration, the CRP models suggest that sentences of over 1 year may be particularly harmful for health, while incarceration is associated with increases in depressive symptoms regardless of sentence length. Regarding the life course timing, these regression models indicate only marginally significant relationships between the timing of incarceration and the outcomes, with incarceration after the age of 18 showing marginally higher associations with CRP, and earlier life incarceration being associated with potentially higher levels of depressive symptoms, though these results are just marginal. In the second stage of the analysis, I restrict my sample to only those who have been convicted of a crime in order to better account for potential selection biases. It's been argued that because individuals who have been convicted but not incarcerated are, quote, closest to the incarceration decision, they may be a particularly useful control group. This approach has been largely lauded in the criminology literature, and results using this analytic approach have proved promising. For example, a recent study by Apel and Sweeten found that individuals convicted of a crime used individuals who were convicted of a crime, only some of whom went on to be subsequently incarcerated, to isolate the effects of incarceration on employment, and documented a strong effect of incarceration on employment difficulties, only for those, of course, who have been incarcerated. Another study by Porter used a similar approach to demonstrate higher levels of fast food consumption and smoking among formerly incarcerated individuals, compared to convicted but not incarcerated individuals. So in this stage of the analysis, I compare the outcomes of individuals who have been convicted but not incarcerated to those who have both been convicted and incarcerated in a traditional regression framework. Here again, I use traditional generalized linear modeling techniques, regressing the outcomes on the exposure measures, controlling for all the covariates that I listed a few slides ago. So restricting my sample to only those convicted, I actually found stronger associations between incarceration and CRP, such that compared to individuals who were not subsequently incarcerated, those who were both convicted and incarcerated had higher levels of physiological inflammation. For depressive symptoms, the results largely remain the same, though slightly diminished in statistical significance. For both outcomes, I found that sentences of over 1 year were really driving these associations, with longer sentences being particularly harmful for health. And for depressive symptoms in particular, I'm finding that early life incarceration appears to have particularly salient mental health consequences. Finally, in this third stage of analysis on the relationship between incarceration and health, I use inverse probability of treatment weighting with regression adjustment. This method requires calculating a propensity score for respondents, which is the probability of incarceration conditional on a set of covariates. Inverse probability of treatment weighting then uses this calculated propensity score to weight observations and create a new pseudo-population in which treatment is no longer confounded by the covariates. IPT weighting balances treatment across respondents, across covariates, by giving more or less weight to respondents with over or underrepresented covariate histories. So in this way, we can think of incarceration behaving as if it was randomly assigned according to the covariates that I include in the study. Unlike propensity score matching techniques, which typically involve dropping a significant number of unmatched individuals, using this approach allows me to retain the full sample of convicted-only respondents that I described a few slides ago. So in addition to using these IPT weights to sort of predict whether or not a person has a high likelihood or not of being incarcerated, I also use a regression adjustment estimator to model the outcome. These models have the property of being doubly robust, such that as long as either the model for the treatment or the outcome is correctly specified, the estimate of the effects of incarceration on health can be considered correctly estimated and unbiased. So in these models, again, I'm only using individuals who have been convicted of a crime in order to minimize unmeasured heterogeneity. In these models, I'm modeling both the outcome and the treatment, and the covariates that I use have some overlap, though they are distinct. So to predict the likelihood of incarceration, including the age and duration of incarceration, I employ all of the covariates that I listed a few slides ago. My outcome models include many of these same covariates, including race, gender, age, neighborhood conditions, as well as socioeconomic measures. So compared to earlier stages of analysis, I again find even stronger associations between incarceration and CRP using these IPT weights with the convicted-only sample. I again find that longer sentences are associated with higher levels of inflammation than shorter ones. Using the IPT weights with the convicted-only sample, however, produced barely non-significant results for depressive symptoms. This graph just visually depicts the results from the previous models from that third stage of analysis using the convicted-only sample. It shows that compared to individuals who are convicted of a crime but not incarcerated, formerly incarcerated individuals have higher levels of inflammation. So finally, in this last set of models for incarceration, I extend my criminal justice contacts, I extend my analyses to earlier stages of criminal justice contact to examine whether pre-incarceration contacts with the criminal justice system might also be related to these markers of health. Here I regress the outcomes on the dummy variables indicating level of criminal justice contact in a multivariate regression framework. In all of these models, all criminal justice contact dummy variables are included simultaneously. Model 1 includes just basic adjustment for age, gender, and race, whereas Model 2 includes the full set of covariates. And here, really, I found the strongest results for the markers of depressive symptoms. Results from Model 1 indicate that a gradient, really, in the associations, with police stops showing marginal associations with depressive symptoms, arrests showing moderate associations, and incarceration having the strongest impact. And I found, across these models, find no association between convictions and health. Finally, to assess the extent to which contacts with the criminal justice system and disparities in those contacts may contribute to population-level differences, black-white differences in particular in the outcomes, I conduct parametric regression models for causal mediation. For depressive symptoms models, these mediation analyses indicated that blacks had more depressive symptoms than whites, that contacts with the criminal justice system in the form of stops, arrests, and incarceration were associated with increases in depressive risk, and that blacks had more contacts with the criminal justice system than whites. The estimate of the indirect or mediating effect of contacts with the criminal justice system on black-white disparities in health indicated that the average depressive score in the population would increase by about 1 or 2 depressive symptoms if all individuals had similar levels of criminal justice contact as blacks in the population. This suggests that contacts with the criminal justice system are an important contributor to racial disparities and depressive risk on a population level. In this way, then, we can think about criminal justice contact as being a key driver of black-white differences in psychological health risk, net of all the other covariates. Because the experience of incarceration alone was still relatively rare this early in the life course, I did not find that incarceration alone helped to explain away any of the black-white differences in psychological risk. However, accounting for racial differences in contacts along the criminal justice continuum accounted for a significant proportion of the black-white health gap on a population level. So I argue that this study offers several key contributions to our understanding of the role of the criminal justice system in social inequality broadly and health disparities specifically. First, the results presented here indicate that incarceration in particular, in context with the criminal justice system more generally, are important drivers of population health and population health disparities. Across several stages of analysis that I presented, which included basic regression models, a unique treatment control design, the use of treatment weighting procedures, I document a consistent relationship between incarceration and health, where formerly incarcerated individuals had higher levels of inflammation than those who were never incarcerated. This relationship persisted even after accounting for a host of potential background characteristics and accounting for potential selection by including these different modeling techniques. So while concerns about selection and endogeneity and causality have been consistently raised as concerns in this literature, my findings suggest that using robust techniques to account for selection only strengthen the association between incarceration and health, which speaks to the potentially powerful influence that incarceration has on the lives and well-being of individuals. Analyses extended to other criminal justice contexts provided new insights into how police stops, arrests, convictions, and ultimately incarceration may also be playing into population health inequality. I want to point out that these results also emerged relatively early in the life course. As I pointed out in the beginning of my talk, at wave 4, when the outcomes were measured, respondents were just 24 to 32 years of age. In this way, then, the results speak to the powerful effect that the criminal justice has on young people's lives. Their exposure to the criminal justice system occurred when they're in their adolescence, their teens and 20s. So in this way, we can think about the criminal justice system as serving as a relatively early driver in the emergence and divergence of population health disparities. Second, my findings also suggest that stress may be a particularly powerful mechanism linking criminal justice contexts to health. The outcomes utilized in the study include markers of psychological and physiological well-being with documented links to the body's stress response. Scholars have hypothesized that the physical and emotional environment of prisons and jails, which are characterized by solitude, fear of crime, and victimization, may irreparably alter the body's ability to maintain optimal health. The stigma and damage of social relationships that extends beyond one's prison term may serve to further exacerbate physiological and psychological health risk. Stress may also be implicated in the relationship between police stops, arrests, and health, and in particular, repeated stops. There are stops and arrests that are particularly discriminatory, aggressive, or physically threatening may have particularly harmful consequences for health. By using these pre-disease markers of health risk, this study contributes new understanding of the pathways by which the stress inherent in these contexts may affect individual and population health risk. While studies further rarely include measures of duration or life course timing, this study uses both of these important life course concepts. A bit surprising to me, I'll admit, I found little evidence that the timing of incarceration mattered much for health. This may be because the stress, stigma, and socioeconomic disadvantages associated with incarceration emerge regardless of the age at which the incarceration experience occurs. I do find, however, that duration of stays in prison or jails does matter. And while one's physiological state may be better able to recuperate from shorter stays in prison or jail, longer stays would be irreparably harmful to one's mental and physical health risk. Finally, descriptive analyses revealed that blacks were more likely than whites to report contacts with the criminal justice system, particularly in the form of arrest and incarceration. Multivariate analyses modeling depressive risk found that black-white differences in criminal justice contacts did in fact mediate some of these race differences in health. As such, findings suggest that blacks' higher rates of criminal justice contact put them at an increased health risk. And the findings presented here have significant implications not only for population health inequality in a general sense, but for racial health inequities in particular. So this study is not without limitations, which I'm planning to address in future research, including some ongoing projects that I have now. So as I discussed earlier, I limit my sample to black and whites, primarily because of concerns related to sample size. But still, I recognize that these processes that they extend well beyond the black-white binary. And I urge future researchers, including myself, to examine the role of the criminal justice system in the lives of other racial and ethnic groups. Similarly, my samples, particularly in the treatment control analyses, were relatively small by population health standards and prevented me from making many claims about how these processes vary according to gender. We know that women are less likely than men to report contacts with the criminal justice system, but it's likely that their contacts are categorically different from men's, and that the health implications of their encounters with police, courts, juries, judges, and jails may in fact also be different. So moving forward, I would like to extend some of these analyses to examine gender differences in these processes, as well as examining disparities at the intersection of race and gender. Relatedly, this study establishes a link between criminal justice contacts and health, but future researchers, including myself, should really build on the results presented here to examine the behavioral, psychosocial, and material mechanisms that help to explain these linkages. My analyses adjusted for many of these potential mechanisms, which may in fact make some of my estimates conservative, but additional mediation analyses would only help to improve our understanding of these processes. Additionally, while this study has broad implications for racial health disparities, contacts with the criminal justice system, especially incarceration, are still relatively infrequent events early in the life course. A majority of my sample had never been stopped, arrested, convicted, or incarcerated. As such, for me to say much about the role of the criminal justice system in population health and equality on a population level, I would like us to think about the indirect consequences of contacts with the criminal justice system for health. That is, in this study, I examined how individuals' own experiences with the criminal justice system shape their health risk. However, we also know that these contacts have collateral consequences. Having a parent incarcerated, a family member incarcerated, being in a community where 1 in 2 Black men is sent to prison has significant implications for the lives of individuals, even if they themselves have not been directly affected. And so this is really where I really see much of my future work going. And finally, as longitudinal biomarker data in particular becomes available, our ability to make causal inferences about the relationship between the criminal justice system and health will only be improved. So, in sum, this study has important implications, not only for health in a general sense, but for population health and equality in particular. As I discussed earlier in my talk, Blacks in the US are more likely to have contacts with the criminal justice system in the form of stops, searches, arrests, convictions, and incarceration. Further research suggests that their contacts with the criminal justice system are categorically different, and that they're more likely to report abuse of force and threats to their own physical and mental well-being. Recent media attention to the killing of Blacks by police has only served to highlight this issue. And while these acts of state violence against Black have been the target of recent media and activist attention, I think what my research suggests is that even those contacts that do not result in shootings or other forms of physical violence have lasting health effects. In essence, the consequences of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration extend to population health beyond just instances that involve the use of lethal force. As such, it's time that we consider the criminal justice system not only a driver of social and racial inequality broadly, but an essential determinant of racial health inequality in particular. So thank you again for having me here today, and I look forward to hearing all your comments and questions.
All right, time for some questions.
Yes. So this is an important point, right? So bail reform has gotten a lot of attention recently, in part because people are spending years sometimes in jail without having been convicted of a crime because they can't afford bail, right? And so Bruce Western, a sociologist in particular, has argued that we criminalize poverty in the United States, and this is one of the processes through which this occurs. So I myself haven't looked at this process, right? But I think it's vitally important. In a couple stages of the analysis, the multivariate regression models where I don't restrict the sample to that treatment control design, and also when I think about the contacts along the criminal justice system, I include people who have been incarcerated, which includes people who have spent time in jail but haven't been convicted of a crime, and still find significant effects. The frustrating part of this is that it's hard for me to sometimes tease these processes out of the data given sample sizes, but I think it's vitally important, right? The role of how the process of being jailed is different from being in prison following a conviction. But I think there's definitely potential differences in how those processes unfold and relate to health. One that I'm not able to explore fully with this data, but one that I think requires some careful attention. Yeah, it's a great question.
Just quick.
Yeah.
You don't have the ability to assess what type of prison or where they went, right?
No, so they ask,
public versus private, federal versus state.
no, that's the frustrating thing, right? So they ask, have you ever spent time in a prison or jail?
Okay.
And so I also have if they've been convicted, but it's hard for me to sometimes tease these processes out, right? And so but I agree. And I mean, the other thing that I've been thinking about too, and that others have sort of brought up to me along the way, is that incarceration in many ways doesn't just occur in prison and jails, but we're thinking about like detention facilities. Lots of different types of detention facilities as potentially also playing a role here. But that I wish I had the data for, but unfortunately don't. But yeah.
The depressive symptoms that the National Longitudinal study looked at, did
Yeah.
those include anxiety? I'm just curious why anxiety didn't get looked at, or if those were folded into it, like hypervigilance, hyperarousal, or threat response.
Yeah, so again, this is sort of just a byproduct. Like, love the data you have, not the one you want to be with. Yeah, and so they don't have sort of full battery of questions on anxiety that allow me to be confident in sort of assessing anxiety. But the depressive symptoms measure that I use, it's based on the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. And so it's sort of this comprehensive measure that in many ways you could do sub-analyses based on subscales for things like anxiety and other things. But I haven't looked at that yet. It's a good question. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, similarly, how stable is the measurement of CRP? How amenable to rising and how quickly, in other words, how does that enter into your equation?
Right. So the measure of CRP is more stable than a measure of, say, cortisol, let's say, okay? But it is, in fact, can reflect exposure to more acute things like infections in particular, right? So if you have a virus or a cold or have been exposed to an infectious agent, your CRP levels are going to rise. I did some supplementary analyses where I restricted the sample. So I, for example, did things like just included people who had CRP under 5. So the measure of CRP in a sort of like healthy individual with low levels of inflammation should be below 1. 1 to 3 is considered sort of more of a chronically elevated, moderately elevated level of CRP. 10 and above sometimes, but not always, is used as an indicator of an acute infection. So I did sort of different levels of supplementary analysis where I included people with above 10 as a potential way to weed out people who have more sort of just an acute rise in their CRP levels. I also did that for 5, and the results largely held. So the analyses that I presented here were just people with CRP of less than 10 included in the analysis. But, CRP is, there's been sort of lots of work, and in fact, you should probably talk to Morgan, she's probably more of the expert than me here on CRP, about the relative stability over weeks for people with sort of these chronically elevated levels that I'm kind of most interested in. Yeah.
So how do you separate the effects of socioeconomic status, poverty, food inequality, other variables which are going to influence how people grow up? The health impacts of those, especially during the critical periods in young lives, from the effects you're seeing due to incarceration. Can you see them as being additive, cumulative? How do you do this?
Yeah.
It's one thing because it's one thing to try to capture data when you're talking about juveniles or adolescents, but how much information do you have that allows you to be able to parse out that kind of pre-incarceration background?
Yeah. So these are the list of covariates that I include in the analysis. So if we're talking about things like socioeconomic status, what I have is measures of family socioeconomic status in adolescents prior to these contacts occurring. I also include a measure of respondent education, so like their own completed education. For neighborhood characteristics, these are also measured in, so all of these things except for respondent education, age, and these two are measured in adolescence, so sort of like prior to the experience of incarceration. And so on the one hand, right, in the first two stages of the incarceration analysis, essentially I control for these as potential confounders. In the third stage of the analysis, what I do is I use these covariates to predict someone's likelihood of being incarcerated, right? And so that's sort of where it allows me to see to what extent is incarceration harmful for health, being driven largely by these background characteristics, or not, right? And so for the measure of inflammation, what I find is that of course these things are sort of increasing individuals' propensity to be incarcerated, but they're not in fact accounting for that linkage, right? I mean, this is as convincing as I can make the argument using non sort of randomly assigned experimental data, which in fact, people are starting to think about ways in which we can do quasi-experimental designs. But in fact, what I'm trying to say is that I'm using sort of these sort of background characteristics to create a propensity score, which is sort of the likelihood of someone's being incarcerated. Because you're right, I mean, a lot of this is sort of, and that's the concern always in this literature, is that it's these things that are impacting health rather than the incarceration experience in and of itself.
As a follow-up,
Yeah.
have you run these same analyses, including these variables, in addition to any number of family members who've also been incarcerated?
So I don't have that
To look
data.
at that.
But that's what I'm doing in a subsequent project now. So I'm working with some graduate students in sociology and demography. We're using data from the Fragile Family Study, which some of you may have heard about. But they oversampled individuals who had parents, particularly fathers, that were incarcerated. And they followed them from birth through now like age 15. And so this is a huge part of it, right? That I think that parental or family member incarceration is also largely implicated in a lot of this. And in fact, when I only include in the mediation analysis, where I'm trying to figure out how much of black-white disparities on a population level are driven by incarceration, I'm only including these direct exposures, which I think is incredibly conservative. In a related but not related new venture for me, I'm using Twitter data to try to think about the ways in which the police use of force is implicated in depressive risk on a population level, thinking about how people just sort of living in a world in which this disproportionality and structural racism in policing practices exists, whether or not that is in and of itself a driver of population health risk, without ever having to have been stopped or searched yourself. Yeah.
Part of the environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Was there any data on gender and how that impacts race and incarceration and mental health outcomes? And the second point I wanted to ask was, I know you sort of mentioned the duration mattered more than the age
Yeah.
at which incarceration happened, but I'm still puzzled by that because I work with young people and there's like a lot of influence that happens at that age, and it does it's particularly formative for the age. So I'm sort of, I want to hear more about what you found out about that age.
Yeah, so first, I think I heard probably half of your question about gender.
Yes, I just said, was there any, what relationships came out in your data?
So I wasn't able to sort of distill whether these processes unfolded differently for men and women, though I suppose that I hypothesize that they likely do. In part because the vast majority of the sample who reported contacts with the criminal justice system were men. I think this is particularly because of the age range that I include, that men sort of like contact with the criminal justice system peaks around late teen years, early 20s, and then falls, whereas women have just different criminal justice contact trajectories than men. So I think that's part of it. Women have higher depressive symptoms too, right? And so that's also likely something that I could, as these folks age, think about. So the timing piece, right? So I was also really startled by this. And I think, so I hypothesize in the paper that why I find this is that, that this experience is harmful to health regardless of the age that it occurs, likely because of different mechanisms, I also think, though, that there's likely some underlying data issues that are behind this finding. The first being that we know that individuals who are incarcerated before the age of 18 are likely to also be incarcerated after the age of 18. My sample at wave 4 excludes anyone who's incarcerated at that wave because they weren't able to get into the prisons or jails to collect data from these people. Okay, so in some ways you can think that this is probably pretty conservative because the people who are incarcerated at wave 4 are excluded, which limits the sample size too. I also think there's not a ton of young people who report in a nationally representative sample being incarcerated under the age of 18. You can also think, even though I use serving sampling weights and other things to adjust for sample representation, that it sort of reflects a nationally representative sample, I think there are limits to that. So even as a quantitative social scientist, I recognize the limitations of weighting strategies to derive nationally representative estimates, right? And so I think it would be very likely to me that someone who was incarcerated under the age of 18 may be particularly apprehensive about participating in a survey that follows them, collects blood samples. So I think that, there's potentially more work to do there. Yeah.
Was it only one CRP measurement that you took? Or
What's that?
You took, but the study, was it only take like one sample per person, or did they do it over a period of time?
So they took one. The fifth wave of data was just released at the beginning of the spring. So I now could use longitudinal CRP data. Yeah.
So another finding that I found kind of surprising was that you had these positive associations with everything in terms of increased depressive symptoms except conviction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any ideas about why that would be the case? Like why conviction doesn't seem to be affecting it in the same way that all these other contacts in the system do?
Yeah, I was surprised by that, and it's actually, so this, a recent study came out in the American Sociological Review that used a different sample, and they looked at convictions and health and again found no association. So I don't think it's something particular to this sample. The important thing to note, though, is that these exposure measures are not mutually exclusive, and that when I run the models, but it also, the results held by regardless of how I run the models, I included them all simultaneously. And so, essentially, what I found was that sort of the arrest police stops were totally accounting for any association between conviction and health. So it was really about the contacts with police that seemed to be driving any association between conviction and health. I wonder about, I'm not sure what's going on there, right? And so I think it's worth something to think about. I just wonder about whether I can imagine for all sorts of reasons how going through a trial or accepting a plea or whatever might be a tremendously stressful experience for someone above and beyond police stops and arrests, but we're just not able to sort of distill it using this data. But it's interesting to me that when I saw this other study come out, I had the same finding that something. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was on a jury once in which the person under suspicion was his lawyer told us that after we exonerated him that he was literally in the bathroom throwing up.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a big strapping, tough guy, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
My question though is, I missed something. What is your control population?
So when I limit the treatment to the treatment control sample, I'm basically comparing these two groups. So people who have been convicted of a crime but didn't go on to prison. So they either, didn't had a plea deal where they didn't get prison time, got probation, but they weren't incarcerated, to someone who was both convicted and incarcerated. So your story raises an important point to me that I'm thinking about. about the guy who cried after being exonerated, that potentially it's not the conviction that's stressful, but maybe just the process itself. So regardless of what the final verdict is, whether it's plea or you're found guilty or not guilty, that it's not necessarily the conviction, potentially just the process itself that is stressful, right? So which is another sort of potential process. Yeah, Morgan.
Do you have the ability to look at those who went to trial versus those who put out?
We didn't. It was
I suspect that would be,
Yeah.
that a trial regarding either conviction or exoneration would be much more stressful.
I would love that. I also,
Than a behind the scenes plea bargain.
yes, I also really wish, which they don't ask, is if the person says they did the crime that they were convicted. Because I also can imagine all sorts
Yeah.
of disabilities that are
How about general neighborhood population versus those going through the specific process?
What do you mean by that?
Like taking it on a neighborhood basis,
Yeah.
a general population type of concept.
Right, so I don't do that in this study, though others have started to do that. So Anna Haskins, who's at Cornell, has started to look at how the incarcerated the density of the incarcerated population in your neighborhood, so then sort of the amount of people that go on to prison and jail from your neighborhood, how that has consequences, particularly for measures of child development. But I don't do that here. Yeah. Yeah.
Also in points of disclosure and measuring duration.
Yeah.
What are the differences that you see? I know that you measure depression more so than anxiety, but for like the cycle of recidivism and going through that process again and again. So say you have an individual going through that process several times in the course of the span is 5 years, which is someone who's been incarcerated for 5 years.
Yeah.
How is that? Do you see differences in stress level? Is one more traumatizing or triggering than the other?
Yeah, so unfortunately I'm not able to distill some of that. It's sort of like total time. But this is a question, right? That it's not just duration, but also frequency that I think is important. That would also play out, I think, for some of these processes too, right? So it's not, I don't have duration measures, obviously, but sort of frequency measures I don't have. I just sort of have a repeated question about have you ever, not number of times, but you can imagine the ways in which that would matter a lot, right?
All right, if there are no other questions, then, sorry?
Yeah.
This comes to mind, so this is the criminal justice side of it, and part of it, if you look at the standpoint of the criminal justice system itself and the police, there's a concern about protecting the police and making sure that they are, they're following the process, but they themselves are, a profession who have a certain amount of stress and going into various kinds of situations that have varying degrees of potential stress or danger or a threat to them. And so is anyone working on sort of on the flip side of this, such that you're trying to understand the context in which the police are operating and how these two whole sets of variables or perspectives are coming together?
Yeah, so there has been some work in criminology and psychology on the health of police officers. And in fact, you do find that they report really high levels of anxiety and PTSD and trauma and other things. And it's vitally important that we think about these processes and also the ways in which police officers' mental health is impacting the encounters of these people. Right.
That's one way.
Right, and so I think that's understudied for a lot of different reasons, but I think could be sort of an emerging field of interest, right? The ways in which police officers' mental health, their own levels of anxiety and trauma are potentially playing out to create huge disparities both in contact but also in terms of the context of the encounter. Levels of hostility, threat, and violence, right? But I don't think those two things have emerged, but I think you're right that it's a potentially really powerful way of thinking about how these processes interact with each other.
Yeah, so sort of following up on that, I think in terms of talking about maybe the types of implications that this work might have in whether it's policy or anything. It seems like there are some things you can pull out, in talking about sentencing policies or anything. So what, in your opinion, having looked at all this data, do you feel that there are kind of solid recommendations that you feel very good about putting forward, or is it all very amorphous still?
So as a sociologist, it's like deconstruct structural racism as it relates to the criminal justice system, right, as like priority number one. But like speaking to policymakers about like what this could actually look like. The question about bail reform, I think, is really important. So all these questions about how long, whether someone can be incarcerated and for how long before they're even convicted of a crime, shows that this is vitally important to population health and that it has tremendous consequences, particularly for poor communities and Black men in particular. So for me, bail reform and sentencing reform are huge, huge. Because really what we're doing is we're incarcerating poverty. We're criminalizing poverty in a way that does not occur for people who can just pay their bail. And so, I think the story, for example, of Khalif Browder, who, is sort of a widespread story. The New Yorker did this sort of expose of his story, was incarcerated for 3 years at Rikers Island, starting at the age of 16, because he was accused of stealing a backpack. His bail was something like $500, and his family couldn't piece it together. Now, to think about what the consequences of that incarceration experience were for him versus someone from a more middle, upper class background, I mean, it's sort of like maddening, right? So for me, bail reform and sentencing reform are sort of two key areas. The other thing that I think is important, so that's sort of from a prevention standpoint. I mean, there's also lots of work being done about the ways in which policing practices and surveillance practices are implicated here. I also, in like sort of another area of my work, think about social relationships and social integration as sort of a vital pathway for protecting people's health. And so Bruce Western, a sociologist, studies formerly incarcerated individuals, and has this tremendous book that just came out. And he's coming to the Penn Sociology Colloquium, so you all should come see him, about the ways in which individuals who have been incarcerated are so isolated upon release, and that there's very few pathways for reintegration, both with their families and their sort of social ties, employment-wise, right? So like, check the box, these ban the box initiatives to sort of ban asking about convictions on job applications. Questions about housing, so the fact that convicted felons can't get access to public housing or public assistance in many states across the United States, right? Like, these are tangible efforts that even if someone is unfairly convicted, or even if they've committed a crime, once they've been released, we still continue to punish people in ways that have tremendous implications for their health. And so things like banning the box, thinking about public assistance and public housing for formerly incarcerated individuals, are sort of like more tangible ways that I think we could go about reversing some of these potentially harmful consequences.
And in the adjudication and sentencing process, such a person who's in prison is much more likely, it seems to me, to be judged guilty and then sentenced for time served.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Catch-22, double whammy.
Right, exactly. So there's lots that we can do around sentencing and sort of pre-conviction treatment of people in ways that we see play out in such stereotypical ways about who gets on house arrest and who doesn't. All of these sorts of things, but the fact that we send people basically to prison or jail, awaiting trial for years at a time, is a sort of concrete place in the process where I think intervention needs to occur.
All right, well, thank you very much.